Welcome to Life Stories, where we dive deep into the complex webs of family dynamics, secrets, and the hidden power struggles that unfold behind closed doors. Today's story follows a woman's journey as she navigates the subtle manipulations of her controlling mother-in-law, uncovering dark secrets and learning the true price of power. As the tension builds, alliances shift, and a quiet war begins to brew, you'll see how one small act of defiance can change everything. Stay tuned, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to begin today's captivating tale. Let's start the story now. The evening began with the quiet elegance that had become so familiar to me over the years of marriage. The dining room shimmered under the golden glow of the chandelier, casting soft halos of light on the immaculate mahogany table. It was always like this when we gathered at Margaret's house, everything meticulously arranged, as though every corner of the space had been carefully curated to evoke a sense of wealth and perfection. The porcelain dishes gleamed, and the crystal glasses filled with the finest aged wine sparkled with an almost mystical allure. And yet, in the midst of this grandeur, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. At the head of the table sat Margaret, my mother-in-law. She was every bit the embodiment of the family's traditions, gracious, poised, and commanding attention without so much as a word. Her face, always unreadable, showed no sign of warmth or affection. In her world, perfection was not a mere goal, it was a requirement. And while I had long since accepted my place in her grand design, tonight, something about her presence felt different. It wasn't that she was acting out of the ordinary, rather, it was the subtle way she watched me, as though she was waiting for something. This, Margaret said as she gestured toward my plate, is a recipe I learned from a Michelin-starred chef. Something special, just for you. Her voice was smooth, almost indulgent, but I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. It was an offer I was meant to appreciate, to accept with grace and gratitude. A rare olive branch extended from a woman who had never truly accepted me into her perfect world. But instead of feeling honored, I felt uneasy. There was an underlying tension, an unspoken message buried in the words. I had learned over the years to trust my instincts, and they were telling me to be cautious. But this was Margaret, the matriarch of the family, and this was her way of showing affection, or at least what she believed was affection. I knew better than to challenge it, and so, I did what I had learned to do best. I smiled politely, lifting my fork with feigned nonchalance, as I tried to push aside the unease gnawing at my stomach. The salad in front of me looked beautiful, too beautiful. The crisp romaine leaves gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, sprinkled with slivered almonds and pomegranate seeds, and a delicate drizzle of dressing. The colors were vibrant, the presentation flawless, but as I lifted my fork and brought it closer to my lips, I caught a whiff of the dressing. It smelled off, not rotten, not entirely unpleasant, but there was something subtle about it. Something chemical, a sharp undercurrent beneath the usual tang of vinaigrette. My stomach churned slightly, but I forced a smile and took a bite, determined to play along. Across from me, my sister-in-law Caroline was already halfway through her plate, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing inside me. Caroline, the golden child, the family's pride, she was always so perfect, so poised, forever outshining me, even when I never played her game. And tonight, she was at it again, unknowingly proving just how much better she was than I could ever be. The thought left a bitter taste in my mouth. Try it, Margaret coaxed, her voice silky, almost indulgent. I had you in mind while making it. I hesitated just long enough for Noah to glance at me. He was absorbed in a conversation with his father, too lost in their talk of work to notice the subtle wars waged between the women in his life. Typical. I twirled a forkful of salad, pretending to examine it as though admiring the effort that had gone into its creation. Looks delicious, I murmured, bringing the fork closer to my lips but never quite letting it touch. The scent intensified, my stomach twisted in discomfort. I needed to think fast. Caroline had already finished her portion, wiping her mouth delicately with a linen napkin, smiling smugly as if proving once again how effortlessly she could outshine me in every little thing. My gaze flicked to my plate, then to hers, and in that split second, an idea formed. I set my fork down deliberately, pretending to adjust my napkin as I shifted in my chair. With a casual nudge, I pushed my plate slightly forward, just enough for Caroline to take its place. Then, as my fingers brushed against the cool porcelain, I made the smallest of adjustments. A subtle flick of my wrist, and the plates exchanged positions, all under the cover of a casual movement. Caroline barely noticed. She was too busy gloating over some recent work achievement, basking in the praise of our father-in-law. Margaret, however, noticed everything. Her eyes flickered for a fraction of a second too long, catching the subtle shift in the plates. I met her gaze, smiling sweetly, mirroring her earlier expression of unreadable warmth. Slowly, I lifted my fork again and took a bite of the salad Caroline had originally been served. Margaret's expression shifted just slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. She was watching closely now, but I couldn't read the look in her eyes. Was it concern, satisfaction, or something darker, more calculating? As I chewed the first bite of the salad Caroline had left behind, I couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction ripple through me. The dressing, though still off-putting in its chemical undertone, didn't affect me the way it had affected her. I barely registered the discomfort. And yet, I was keenly aware of the subtle shift in the room. The once lively conversation seemed to pause, just for a heartbeat, as the sound of clinking glasses and casual chatter filled the air. I had known, deep down, that Margaret had orchestrated this. It was a test, a trap, and for the first time since I had married Noah, I realized I had played the game better than she had expected. There was a part of me that wanted to feel guilty, to feel remorse for what I had just done. But I didn't, not even a little, because in that moment, I knew exactly what Margaret was capable of, and I wasn't about to let her manipulate me any longer. Caroline, on the other hand, was oblivious. She wiped her mouth delicately with a napkin, her earlier smugness beginning to waver. A bead of sweat formed on her forehead, and her breathing seemed to grow heavier. But she kept going, shoving more greens into her mouth with the same practiced elegance. I could see the subtle shift in her posture, the slight furrow in her brow, the telltale signs that something wasn't right. Minutes passed, and I watched her with a growing sense of anticipation. My stomach churned, but not from what I had eaten. It was from the anticipation of what was about to unfold. As Caroline shifted in her seat, a sharp cough escaped her lips. She cleared her throat, once, then again, more forcefully. Noah glanced up at her, his concern for his sister momentarily breaking his usual aloofness. "Are you okay?" Noah asked, his voice filled with the kind of concern that could only come from a sibling. The kind that would never fully understand the tension between the women in his life. "Yeah," Caroline muttered, waving a hand dismissively. "Just dry spices or something." But there was a tightness in her voice, something that wasn't natural. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her glass of water, her face growing pale. Margaret, ever the composed matriarch, watched Caroline with a narrowed gaze, her fingers curling around her wineglass, tightening as if she was holding onto something precious, something fragile. She said nothing, but I saw it in her eyes, the confirmation that she knew. She knew exactly what had happened, and she knew that I knew. As Caroline's discomfort intensified, I forced myself to suppress a smirk. I wasn't gloating, not yet. But I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. Margaret had played her cards. But she had underestimated me. She had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to protect myself from her manipulations. Noah seemed oblivious, still absorbed in the conversation with his father, too distracted to see the storm that had quietly begun to brew at the table. Margaret, however, was keenly aware. She was watching me, studying my every move, as if trying to figure out if I was truly as innocent as I appeared. She had lost control of the situation, and now she was scrambling to regain it. I watched Caroline as she took another bite of the salad, chewing slowly, her face twitching in discomfort. Sweat beaded along her hairline, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She was starting to understand, just as I had hoped she would. But even as the discomfort spread across her face, she refused to acknowledge it out loud. She wasn't ready to confront the truth, not yet. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, Caroline stood abruptly, her chair scraping noisily against the hardwood floor. The tension in the room was palpable as she bolted from the table, her footsteps echoing through the house as she hurried toward the guest bathroom. Silence fell over us, broken only by the faint sound of her distant retching. I turned slowly, my gaze meeting Margaret's across the table. She hadn't moved an inch. She was still seated, fingers wrapped tightly around her wineglass. But her expression had shifted. There was a crack in her facade. She looked rattled for the first time in years. And I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. For the first time, I had managed to turn the tables. Margaret was no longer in control. I was. Delicious salad, I said sweetly, my voice carrying just enough sarcasm to sting. I couldn't resist the jab. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at me. Her expression unreadable. But I saw it. The flicker of something behind her eyes. It was a mixture of surprise, frustration, and perhaps even a little fear. She knew, as I did, that the game had changed. Her silence was deafening, and I let it hang in the air between us, thick with unspoken tension. She was no longer the puppet master. Margaret had lost the first round, and she was beginning to realize it. The question was, how would she respond? Would she retreat into the shadows, plotting her next move, or would she confront me directly? I wasn't sure what to expect. But I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Margaret wasn't the type to back down easily. And neither was I. The silence that followed Caroline's abrupt exit was suffocating. The once lively dining room, filled with the soft hum of polite conversation, felt like the calm before a storm. Margaret had resumed talking to Richard. But I noticed she barely touched her food. She kept stealing glances at the hallway, her eyes flicking toward the bathroom where Caroline had disappeared. It was clear to me now. The wheels in Margaret's mind were turning. Calculating, strategizing her next move. I tried to ignore the growing tension in the room, pretending to focus on my meal. But I couldn't help but feel a rush of adrenaline coursing through me. I had taken the first step in my plan. But Margaret wasn't someone who would let a loss go unanswered. She was too sharp, too deliberate, and as much as I had enjoyed the small victory tonight, I knew that the real battle had just begun. The dinner continued on, but the normal flow of conversation had been replaced by an underlying current of discomfort. Margaret's eyes flicked back and forth, scanning the room as if looking for a sign that the game had shifted in her favor. But there was nothing she could do to erase the damage that had already been done. Caroline was beginning to question her loyalty to her mother. And as much as Margaret tried to hide it, I could see the cracks in her perfect facade. Noah was still distracted, talking to Richard about some business issue. He never noticed the subtle wars that raged between his mother and me. That had always been the case. He was too immersed in the world Margaret had built around him to see the manipulation, the control. But tonight, he was beginning to sense something was off. I could feel the tension building between us. The slow realization settling in his mind that I was no longer just the obedient daughter-in-law I had once been. As the meal wound down, the chatter grew quieter. Margaret and Richard exchanged some polite pleasantries. But I could tell that the conversation was no longer a priority for either of them. Margaret's mind was elsewhere, her thoughts racing through the events of the evening. She was waiting for Caroline to return. Waiting to see if the truth would finally break through her daughter's blind loyalty. And as much as I had hoped that Caroline would confront her mother, I knew better than to expect her to do so soon. She had spent her entire life under Margaret's influence, molded into the perfect daughter, the one who could do no wrong. But I had planted the seed of doubt in her mind. And that was all it took to start unraveling Margaret's control. Caroline was beginning to see through the veil of perfection Margaret had carefully constructed around herself. And for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope for her. As the minutes stretched on, I could hear the faint sounds of Caroline's footsteps in the hallway. She emerged from the bathroom looking pale, her makeup smudged, her eyes wide with confusion. She gripped the doorframe for support, her hands trembling. "I think I'm fine," Caroline muttered, though her voice was strained. There was no denying the change in her. She was no longer the confident, untouchable sister-in-law I had once competed with. She was vulnerable, unsure of what had just happened, and unsure of who to trust. Margaret, ever the composed matriarch, stood up from the table with a delicate smile. Moving toward Caroline with practiced ease, she placed a hand on her daughter's arm, her voice dripping with sweetness. "You're feeling better, darling?" Caroline nodded, though I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Margaret's smile faltered for just a second before she regained her composure. She had no idea what Caroline was truly thinking. And that, in itself, was a victory. Margaret had lost her grasp on the narrative. And for once, she wasn't the one pulling the strings. Noah, still oblivious to the power play unfolding before him, looked between his mother and sister, his concern deepening. He had no idea what had happened at the table. No idea that Caroline had just experienced a moment of clarity. The moment when the illusions of Margaret's perfection began to crumble. I remained silent, watching the scene unfold. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. And I knew that Caroline was no longer the same person she had been when she sat down to dinner. The trust she had always placed in Margaret had been shaken. And the seed of doubt I had planted was starting to grow. As Margaret and Caroline exchanged a few more words, I quietly excused myself from the table. I didn't need to be a part of their conversation anymore. The groundwork had been laid. Margaret may have believed she still had the upper hand. But I knew the truth. The power in this family was no longer solely in her hands. Tonight had been a small victory. But the real battle was yet to come. And I was ready for it. The next few days passed in a tense quiet, each moment dragging with the weight of anticipation. Margaret, as always, held her composure, but I knew that beneath the surface, her mind was working tirelessly, calculating her next move. The family dinner had been a small victory, but I knew Margaret wouldn't allow herself to be outmaneuvered for long. She was too intelligent, too precise, and yet, as the hours ticked by, I realized something important. Margaret had underestimated me. I had grown used to the way she played her games. The manipulation, the careful crafting of her perfect world. But what she didn't understand was that I had spent enough time observing her, learning her every move, that I could see through the illusion she had created. Margaret wasn't as untouchable as she thought. And the truth was, I had just begun to play. One evening, as the family gathered for another dinner, one far more subdued than usual, I found myself noticing something I hadn't seen before. Richard, her husband, seemed restless. His gaze flicked between me and Margaret, and I could see the discomfort in the way he shifted in his chair. It wasn't just the usual unease around me. It was something more, something deeper. Richard was uncomfortable with what had transpired. And for the first time, I realized that he might be more aware of Margaret's manipulations than he let on. As dinner wore on, I carefully watched the two of them, trying to read between the lines of their conversation. Margaret, of course, maintained her usual air of grace and control. But I saw it, the way her eyes lingered just a little too long on Richard when he mentioned a recent business trip. There was something in her gaze. Something sharp and predatory. She was always so in control of the room. But now, I saw the subtle cracks in her armor. She wasn't as composed as she wanted everyone to believe. Later that evening, after dinner had ended, I found myself alone in the hallway. Richard had excused himself, likely to retreat into his study with his whiskey. Margaret was busy in the living room, speaking with Caroline, who still seemed unsettled from the events of the previous days. As I passed by the study, I caught a glimpse of Richard sitting alone at his desk, his fingers tapping nervously against his glass. Something told me I needed to speak with him. Something deep inside me told me that if I was going to get any answers, it would be from him. I knocked softly on the door, pushing it open slightly to find Richard looking up at me, his eyes weary but curious. "Everything all right, Richard?" I asked, my voice casual, though I was acutely aware of the tension in the air. He paused for a moment, his gaze flicking toward the door, then back to me. "Fine," he replied, his voice strained. "Just a lot on my mind." I stepped into the room slowly, closing the door behind me. "I've noticed that," I said gently, sitting across from him. "Is everything really fine?" Richard didn't answer right away. His hands trembled slightly as he set down his glass, his eyes flicking to the stack of papers on his desk. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret has been holding something over me for years. I don't know how to get out from under it. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. The crack in Margaret's perfect world was finally showing. Richard was the key. The foundation she had built. The control she wielded over everyone. Was starting to crumble. What do you mean? I asked, keeping my voice soft, coaxing him to continue. Richard hesitated for a moment longer before speaking again. She's been keeping files on everyone. He muttered. Everyone in this family. Business associates. Even friends. There are things she's blackmailing people with. It's how she keeps control. I leaned forward, my breath catching in my chest. This was more than I had ever hoped for. This was the opening I needed. Where are the files? I asked carefully, my voice steady despite the excitement bubbling beneath the surface. Richard's gaze flicked nervously toward the door. He knew better than to say too much in front of Margaret. But the desperation in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. In her office, he said quietly, there's a safe. She keeps everything locked away. But there's something I can't ever let her find out I told you. My pulse quickened. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The key to taking down Margaret. To pulling back the curtain on her twisted control. I need to get into that safe. I said, my voice low but firm. Richard nodded, his face pale. Be careful, he warned. Margaret isn't someone you can outsmart easily. She always knows when something's off. I smiled softly, a sense of determination settling over me. I'm not outsmarting her, Richard. I'm just playing the game better. And with that, the real work began. As I stood up to leave Richard's study, my heart raced with the weight of what I had just learned. The pieces were falling into place. And I could feel the momentum shifting in my favor. Margaret, once the untouchable matriarch, was losing control, and it was only a matter of time before I brought her empire down. I knew the game wasn't over. But I had finally figured out how to play it. Over the next few days, I began to gather everything I needed. The safe in Margaret's office was my next target. And with Richard's reluctant help, I learned more about its contents. It wasn't just business records, it was her entire web of manipulation. The lies, the secrets, the blackmail, everything that kept her in power. Finally, the day came. I snuck into Margaret's office under the cover of darkness. The safe opening with a soft click as I punched in the combination I had guessed from the clues she had left behind. Inside, I found everything I needed. Documents that would expose her lies and her hold over the family. The evidence was irrefutable. As I walked out of the room, files in hand, I knew that this was the beginning of the end. Margaret could no longer hide behind her perfect facade. I had seen through it. And now, I would make sure everyone else did too. And with that, my battle was won. Margaret's reign of manipulation was over. But I knew, just as she had underestimated me, I would never underestimate her again. She would come after me. But I would be ready. If you enjoy stories like this, filled with power plays, deception, and unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories. Stay tuned for the next chapter.